A lot of the farmers were discouraged because the invaders, Germanic invaders, would come in, steal everything from the Roman fields, but oftentimes Roman soldiers who went off to defend the Roman Empire against the invaders would help themselves to the Roman fields. Hey, this farmer has a ripe field and we're starving. So the Roman farmer had no chance between his own soldiers from his own side were enemy invaders. And in those days, the government did not feed its soldiers, except for the ones who lived in barracks. When they went out in the field, they didn't have supply lines that could keep up with a moving army. I mean, the soldiers were so fast, they'd outrun the supply lines, so the soldiers were expected to forage for food, that is, find food wherever they could, steal it from local farmers, or hunt, fish, or whatever, any way they could get food. And the result was crops were destroyed. Armies were needed, but it was difficult to enlist soldiers, so what the Romans resorted to doing was hiring soldiers, mostly foreigners. Now, another thing that we have now in common, when I wrote my paper 45 years ago, folks, and I don't mind telling how old I am, the United States was not fighting wars in this part of the world. Fast forward to 2014 and we're fighting wars now in the East. The Romans were fighting wars against the ancestors of the same people, fighting wars against the revived Persian Empire. The Persian Empire had been put down by Alexander, but by this time it had revived. Alexander had lived some 400 years before. And Romans were having to send armies to fight the Persians. Now, all told, these wars between Rome and Persia were to last about 600 years. You know, just never ending. Just keep fighting and keep fighting, keep fighting. What finally happened was, what was left of the Roman Empire finally made a really decisive campaign and crushed the Persians, and in the process weakened themselves. Then out from Arabia poured the Muslims, and they conquered both Persia and eventually conquered what was left of the Roman Empire. That's jumping ahead of the story a little bit, but the wars were to last hundreds of years and were to drain Rome's resources. Now, in addition, we'll be talking a little bit about China, the Silk Road. The Silk Road ran from far off China and ended here in the Mediterranean world. Now, its route varied from generation to generation. One generation would go through the mountains, another generation would take a southern route, it would go through northern India. And then when bandits got too bad, they'd take another route back through the mountains, depending on the political stability of the regions they went through. Now, here's the story of the Silk Road. No trader ever started off in China and went all the way to the Mediterranean. As far as we know, there were no Chinese to be found here. What happened, the Chinese they build the products, particularly silk, then they'd sell it to a middleman, who in turn would sell it to the next middleman, who in turn would sell it to the next middleman, and eventually it would find its way into the Mediterranean world. And by the time it got here, the price was way, way up, because each of these middlemen along the way had to make a profit. Roman gold coins found their way out of the empire and all the way into China. And if you visit China today, I've talked to some Chinese, you can still find Roman coins still in China. And the coins never found their way back. In other words, the Romans got silk, porcelains, and other things from China, and the Chinese got Roman gold. What this led to, eventually there was gold didn't completely disappear, but gold became scarce in Europe, and it was to remain scarce until the Spanish conquered part of the New World and brought tons of gold back from the New World to Europe, and then gold became a part of Europe's economy again. But gold was to be absent from Europe for about 12 or 1300 years. Largely absent, not completely absent, but largely absent. All right, after a period of chaos, a new emperor came on the scene named Diocletian. Now, Diocletian, he was a general, and he took over, but unlike the others, apparently he was able to avoid assassination. In fact, he lived long enough to where he finally retired and stepped aside and said, I'm through. But he's more or less split the empire in two. He said it's too difficult to administer the big empire, so he made the Eastern Empire and a Western Empire. And this was to become, well, this was to lead to disaster later. Well, actually, it might have been beneficial. The Eastern Empire was to become the Byzantine Empire that was to last 1,000 years. The Western Empire was fated to fragment and sizzle and fall apart. But the Eastern Empire was to hold together for a while. Anyway, actually, better clarify, Diocletian actually divided the empire into 4 administrative sections, not 2. He divided into 4 and told this to each ruler, you take care of your quadrant, 4 quadrants. Now, to fight the population decline, he said that, well, I want every young man to remain the profession of his father. In other words, if your father were a farmer, you must remain a farmer. If your father were a blacksmith or a tanner, you must become a blacksmith. You must become a tanner. You must remain under the profession of your father. So jobs like baker, shipper, all became hereditary. But soon, in spite of his reforms, everything declined. All right. Well, something else Diocletian did, then I'll move on to Constantine. To support the army, which was heavy, he was having a difficult time paying the troops, and this was one of the things. But to support the army, he set up a bureaucracy. Now, if you don't have a bureaucracy, you have a hierarchy of authority. You have this level, and they're followed by this level. The army is a bureaucracy in itself. We have the general, and under the general are colonels, under the colonels are lieutenant colonels, under the lieutenant colonels are majors, and under the majors are captains. Well, he set up a civilian bureaucracy the same way. And keep this in mind when you study Second Smith, because Germany was to wind up doing the same thing, set up a civilian bureaucracy, and the idea was to get control. In other words, he said to these people, you control everybody under you, and to these people, you control everybody under you. And the idea is we're going to get control of the people, control the profession, and make sure that everybody works, and make sure that we have enough money, in other words, collect all the money that we need to support our army. So he set up a civilian bureaucracy also. And then he retired to see how his system would work, or actually retired because he got old. Constantine. Now, from time to time, I have made mention of the Christians. Christianity had started some 300 years before Constantine, and we will talk about them, of course, when we get to the next page. But Constantine, the reason he's remembered, he was the first Christian emperor. However, we're going to back up in the story a little bit. Diocletian divided the empire into 4s. Well, when Diocletian retired, 2 of the, actually you might say they had a tournament, where the 2 of the top heads fought each other, and one of them won, the other one was killed. The other 2 fought each other, and one of them won. In this case, Constantine won the second. That meant that the 2 winners then had to face each other off. Well, as Constantine was approaching the enemy, he had a dream. Again, folks, you can decide for yourself what you want to make of it. But in the dream, he saw a sign of the cross in the sky, and around the sign of the cross were the words, "In this sign you will conquer." Constantine woke up and immediately ordered that all of his shields have crosses put on them, the shields of the men, and all the men start wearing crosses, and ordered all of his army to become Christian. Now, folk, say what you will. Now, there have been many books written. And in fact, during my master's exam, the issue came up because one of the 12 books I had to read was a book about the conversion of Constantine. And this author felt like Constantine's conversion was genuine. And he gave his arguments, why he felt so. But there's been many books written, was Constantine's conversion genuine or not? It's difficult to tell. Whatever the case, he remained Christian till the day he died. The book I read said that for him to become Christian almost seemed like suicide, because Christians made up a persecuted minority. Most of your emperors, including Diocletian, most of your emperors since Nero had persecuted the Christians. The more energetic and more vigorous emperors had persecuted them the most vigorously. And for him to all of a sudden, as for Constantine, to all of a sudden decide, hey, I'm going to go into battle as a Christian, and I'm going to conquer under the name of Christianity, seemed like political suicide, except for one thing. He went to battle the next day under the sign of the cross, and won the battle, and conquered. And one of his first acts as emperor, once he'd conquered, he became the emperor, of course. One of the first acts was to issue the Edict of Toleration that made Christianity the legal religion of the empire. The Edict of Toleration stopped all Christian persecution by declaring that Christianity was now legal. A lot of persons quickly saw the way that the religious winds were blowing and they became Christian, but a lot of persons didn't. Eventually, though, Christianity was made the official religion of the empire, and given a little bit more time, paganism, the old religion, died out. Now, any history book will be quick to point out, though paganism did not completely die off. A good case can be made that it simply incorporated itself into the church. That Jupiter became Peter, and Isis became Mary, and Isis' son, whom she put back together and brought back to life, became Jesus. That it simply took the old pagan symbols, the old pagan gods, and incorporated them into Christianity. Be that as it may, you can say anything you want to, but Christianity from this point on was to become a huge factor in the story of Western civilization, as Christianity was a spread eventually throughout the rest of the Roman Empire, and eventually spread here into Scandinavia and spread into Russia, and take over almost, practically all of Europe. It's a big factor in the rest of the story. Each of you can decide for yourself how much good it did. Now, I've had more than one pupil, and if you want to say so yourself, you can. More than one pupil who will blame Christianity was what destroyed the Roman Empire. If you wanted to take that stance, you didn't have to explain how come it was Europe, who was the Europeans who burst out from their confines and overspread the whole globe and invented the airplane, invented the television, the telephone, the telegraph, and you have to explain that. But in other words, if you make any connection between culture, between scientific achievement, between politics and religion, my personal take on it is the Roman Empire was already in an advanced state of decline before Constantine came on the scene, and he was unable to reverse the trend, unfortunately. And the big problem that he had was he did not separate church from state. Now later, in the history of Europe, they did separate church from state. The state declined and the church remained strong. Then church and state fought it out for hundreds of years. I'm not saying they should have fought it out, but when the smoke had cleared, church and state were separate, and folk hardly anywhere else in the world can find the separation between religion and the state you can find in Western Europe. Islam certainly did not. The Orthodox Catholic Church did not separate church from state. But in the case of Western Europe, they eventually separated church from state, and I think that was one of the biggest contributions that Christianity was eventually to make. Now, again, anyone will have a comment? I won't argue with you. Your comments are welcome. If you have any thoughts on the subject. After Constantine, the other emperors were Christian except for one named Julian, and he was called Julian the Apostate. He was very unpopular. And after Julian, every one of the emperors at least made a profession of Christianity. Now, Constantine carried on the reforms of Diocletian, requiring that every man stay in the profession of his father. He enforced the bureaucracy in which he tried to support the army. He tried to make the army more mobile. Now, here was a big weakness of the Roman army. If you could look at the individual soldier, he would join the army for 20 years, but during that time he would feel like he was not getting paid enough, so he would set himself in a business. He might decide he would become a glass blower and make bottles, or he might become a potter and make pottery. Well, after 10 years of this, these soldiers became so entrenched in their business that they could not function as soldiers, or they didn't want to move, or they would get married and have children, and then they were so entrenched that they felt like, hey, if I get up and leave, my wife will starve to death. What am I going to do? What's my wife going to do? So they become very, very much entrenched in the affairs of life. Well, Caesar Augustus had tried to fix this problem, but he couldn't. There was the Roman army's lack of mobility, but finally Constantine said, we're going to pay our troops enough to where we can have a group of men who will not allow them to get involved in any other business. They can't become tanners, they can't become blacksmiths. They're soldiers and nothing else. We'll keep them in barracks, and men who can get up and move at an instant's notice. But in other words, a mobile army, all of which he was successful in implementing, but it was a little bit too late. Now, in addition, he set up a new capital. He said things are too chaotic here in Rome, so he found a place in what he thought was the center of the empire. He said, from this place, I can better fight the Persians to the east. His new capital was named Constantinople after himself. Today we call it the city of Istanbul. So he took over, now this is one of the few dates I want you to remember. Constantine took over in 312 CE. 312. And he was to reign for several years. He set up a capital here, and this was eventually to further work towards splitting the empire in two. The Eastern Empire became the Byzantine Empire, which we'll talk about later. The Western Empire fragmented and degenerated, disintegrated after a time. Anyway, now, during his time and afterward, a bunch of German tribes began moving into the Roman Empire, and the Roman government was somewhat powerless to stop them. The most powerful of these were the Visigoths. And in 378, these Visigoths did something that was unheard of. They defeated the Roman legions at a place called Adrianople. Now, some 80 or 90 years ago, there was a book written that became somewhat of a bestseller called The 10 Most Decisive Battles of World History. The Battle of Adrianople was in that book. In the Battle of Adrianople, the Roman legions, for the first time in many, many generations, all the Roman legions were put together into one big battlefield, and they were whipped by the barbaric Germans. Why? The Germans were bigger, for one thing, but also the Romans were greatly outnumbered.